Welcome to the deep dive.
The deep dive.
Where we kind of take a stack of information and try to boil it down to the stuff that matters.
The insight.
Yeah. The gold nuggets.
Yeah.
And present it in a way that we hope respects your time.
Exactly.
And your attention.
Yeah.
And your curiosity.
Yeah. This is tailored just for you. This deep dive is just for you.
It is for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. And today's deep dive centers on a question that has echoed through millennia.
Yeah. It's a big one. A really big one.
That's a huge one.
Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead?
Yeah. So we, for this, we dove into a really fascinating exchange between New Testament scholar Justin Bass and New Testament historian Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
And this came from a premiere, unbelievable question mark YouTube video, which is titled Bart Ehrman versus Justin Bass. Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead?
That's right.
So they had a conversation. It's out there on YouTube. Check it out. It's fascinating.
Great conversation.
Yeah. And we also we pulled in some excerpts from Answering Christians 1. Yeah, it's another YouTube channel, which is Dr. Bart Ehrman Destroys the Crucifixion and the Resurrection History. So we kind of pulled both those, put them in a blender. We're going to see what comes out. So Justin Bass is a Christian scholar who argues for the resurrection. And he bases his arguments on what he calls bedrock facts.
On his rock facts.
Yeah, which are like things that are generally agreed upon within New Testament scholarship.
Right. There's a good deal of consensus on these.
Yeah. And then you have Bart Ehrman. He is
now well known.
Yeah.
New Testament historian.
He's a big name.
Who identifies as agnostic.
Yeah.
And he questions the historical evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah.
And suggests potential naturalistic explanations.
Yeah.
For what happened.
Yeah. So our mission today is to explore their core arguments, the points of contention between these two.
Where they agree, where they disagree.
Yeah. Regarding this very, very central claim. Right.
Of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Which is the resurrection. Okay, so let's dive into this thing. Where do they agree? Where do they find common ground?
So it's important to note that they do agree on a couple of pretty key things, despite their drastically different conclusions about what happened.
Okay.
First, there's a strong consensus among historians, most historians, and Ehrman included here, that Jesus was, in fact, crucified. Even with his critical stance on many aspects of the gospel narratives, Ehrman considers the crucifixion a firmly established event in history.
So, like, we're starting from a brutal execution. Yeah. That's our jumping off point.
That's our starting point.
And where else do they agree?
They also agree that the earliest followers of Jesus claim that he was raised from the dead.
Okay.
Ehrman doesn't dispute at all that this was the absolute heart of the early Christian message, the resurrection, and that the early Christians believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The point of contention is not whether those claims were made,
but rather how we as historians should interpret those claims today.
Okay, so we've got the death, we've got the claim of the resurrection. Now Bass takes it to a new level, and he starts to talk about, well, what is it? What does it mean that they claim that he was resurrected? What is that claim all about?
That's right. That's right.
So how does he approach that?
So Bass argues that the very idea of a resurrected Messiah, especially a crucified one, was completely unprecedented and unique.
Okay.
In Jewish thought at the time.
Mm-hmm.
No one was expecting a Messiah.
Okay.
Who would die and then be raised in the midst of history.
So this wasn't like a thing that was floating around in the zeitgeist.
Not at all.
And then they're like, oh, this fits.
Right.
Okay. So Ehrman obviously has a different perspective.
Yeah, he's got a slightly different take on this. He reminds us that the disciples were largely apocalyptic Jews.
Okay.
And their understanding of the afterlife centered on a future, universal bodily resurrection.
Yeah.
That would happen at the end of time.
Okay. So not just like one person coming back.
Exactly. Everybody's coming back.
Everybody's coming back.
Okay.
So when they had experiences that they interpreted as seeing Jesus alive after his crucifixion, their existing worldview, which focuses on bodily resurrection as the only form of afterlife, would naturally lead them to conclude that God had resurrected Jesus.
Okay, so they weren't expecting a messianic resurrection.
Yeah.
But they were expecting a bodily resurrection.
That's right.
And so when they had whatever experience they had, they interpreted it through that lens.
Exactly.
Okay. That's interesting. So is that like, I mean, that make it feel like more of an interpretation of an experience rather than a totally novel idea?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. All right. So let's move on. Now, Bass talks about the appearances of Jesus after his death. And he feels like these are pretty central to his argument.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does he frame that? So he focuses on what he calls these bedrock appearances. And primarily he's pulling these from Paul's letters, especially 1 Corinthians 15, which contains like a creedal statement.
Okay.
And he highlights the appearances to Peter.
Yeah.
James, who was Jesus' brother, Paul himself, and Mary Magdalene. Now, he argues that these appearances are widely acknowledged by New Testament scholars as reflecting the genuine beliefs of Jesus' earliest followers.
Okay, so he's trying to pick out the ones that
the most reliable ones.
Are kind of universally agreed upon, that they at least really believe that this happened.
Exactly.
Okay. And Ehrman, again, takes a different approach?
He's a little more cautious when he looks at the evidence. He acknowledges that Paul explicitly states that he saw the risen Jesus.
Okay.
And he doesn't necessarily question Paul's sincerity.
Okay.
But he points out that the other appearances to Peter, James, Mary Magdalene, and the group of 500 mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, these aren't directly recorded by them in their own writings.
Okay. So we're left to sort of deduce.
Exactly.
Right.
And particularly that appearance to 500. Ehrman emphasizes that this comes out of nowhere in our earliest sources. Beyond that one mention in Paul's letter.
500 people, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. And you would think that would get more press.
Yeah, you'd think that would be a bigger deal.
Yeah. You'd think if 500 people saw the risen Jesus, that there would be more historical evidence to support that.
Yeah. Like I went to a concert with 500 people. I still talk about that concert.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Ehrman also makes this interesting point about like other religious claims.
Yeah.
And how we sort of think about those versus...
Yeah. He brings up some examples that you might resonate with, like Moroni appearing to Joseph Smith.
Okay.
In the founding narrative of Mormonism.
Okay.
Or the various reported apparitions of Mary within Catholicism.
Okay.
And even the healings that are attributed to figures like Baal Shem Tov or Asclepius. Ehrman's point is, should we apply a different standard of evaluation to claims within the Bible than we do to claims originating from other religious traditions?
Okay.
He argues for consistency in historical inquiry.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yeah.
So are we being consistent in how we judge the evidence?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's a really good question. Should we treat these things differently just because they're from different traditions?
Exactly.
Or do we have a consistent way of evaluating evidence?
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
And then how does Bass counter that?
So Bass argues that early Christian writings actually cite multiple individuals who claim to have witnessed the resurrected Jesus, Peter, James, Paul, Mary Magdalene, and then the 500.
Right.
And he says this is really different compared to the foundational claims of other religious movements, where you often have a single primary witness.
Okay.
Like Joseph Smith claiming he saw Moroni.
Or Muhammad's experiences. He's saying Christianity is different because there were multiple people who claimed to have witnessed it.
Okay, so the quantity of witnesses matters to him.
Matters. Ehrman pushes back on that, though?
Yeah. He offers alternative explanations for these appearances.
Okay. What does he think might be going on?
Well, he suggests the possibility of grief-induced visions, hallucinations.
Okay.
He even cites some statistics that suggest that a significant percentage of people experience seeing deceased loved ones.
Okay.
Or even misidentification.
Right.
Right? He's saying these kinds of experiences are not uncommon.
Okay.
And they could potentially account for the disciples' beliefs.
Okay.
Without a miraculous resurrection.
Yeah, I mean, the human brain is a weird and wonderful thing.
It is.
You know.
Absolutely.
And he also points out that even Paul's account is lacking in some specifics.
Yeah.
So how does he unpack that? So Ehrman points out that while Paul clearly states that he saw Jesus and that God revealed his son to him.
Okay.
He gives very little concrete information about this experience.
Like, what does he leave out?
Like, he doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
The time.
Yeah.
The location.
Yeah.
The specific manner in which Jesus appeared. So it's hard to analyze that experience from a historical perspective.
Okay, so let's go back to Bess's argument for a second, this unexpectedness argument.
Right.
He's saying the disciples wouldn't have just invented this.
That's right.
Like they weren't expecting a resurrection.
Yeah.
How does he make that point?
He emphasizes that the disciples had no pre-existing expectation of a resurrected Messiah.
Right.
And he contrasts this with later traditions, like Catholic expectations of Marian apparitions, where you would expect to see Mary.
Right. Yeah.
So he's saying the resurrection was so contrary to their prior beliefs that they must have had some sort of genuine transformative experience to lead them to such a belief.
Okay, so something must have really happened to shift their thinking that much.
Exactly.
And then how does Ehrman respond to that?
So he approaches this with some skepticism. He suggests it could be post hoc rationalization.
Okay.
Right. He's saying once the disciples came to believe they'd seen Jesus alive, they needed to make sense of that.
Okay.
Within their existing Jewish theological framework.
Okay.
Which included the concept of a future bodily resurrection. So Ehrman's suggesting that the unexpectedness might be a later interpretation to bolster their belief, rather than the cause of their initial conviction.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So now we get to another point that Bass makes, which is that Christianity rose so rapidly. And he thinks that that's some pretty compelling evidence for the resurrection.
That's right. That's right.
So how does he lay that out?
So Bass argues that the growth and the widespread dissemination of Christianity from a small persecuted group in Jerusalem is historically unique. He even mentions Jesus' supposed prediction to spread the message to all nations. And he points to the Christian populations in places like Papua New Guinea as a sort of long-term fulfillment of this.
Oh, wow. Okay. And Ehrman doesn't buy it?
Nope. No. He rejects it. He calls it a theological argument, not a historical one.
Right.
And he says the success of a movement doesn't validate its claims. He uses the example of the Mormon Church, which has also grown really rapidly, but that doesn't prove its origin story.
Okay. Right. Just because something is popular or successful doesn't mean that it's true.
Exactly. Exactly.
But Bass pushes back on that.
He does.
He's like, no, I think there's something to this.
Yeah. He emphasizes the really extraordinary nature of this, that a man who was crucified in the first century is now worshipped by billions of people across the world. And he's saying that such an unprecedented and enduring phenomenon should be looked at.
Okay.
Like it might point to an extraordinary cause.
Okay. So Ehrman
says,
still not convinced.
No. He says widespread belief doesn't equal historical truth.
Right. And he makes a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, just because a lot of people believe something doesn't necessarily make it true.
That's right.
We all probably believe things that aren't true.
Right.
I think I do. Okay, so Bass brings up this other interesting point about like continued visions and dreams of Jesus.
Yes. He mentions this phenomenon of ongoing dreams and visions reported across cultures and time periods, even among people who aren't traditionally religious. He cites Philip Weeb's book, Visions of Jesus, and the concept of Christic visions. And he says this is evidence that Jesus continues to be experienced by people.
Wow. Okay. Ehrman.
Of course. There's something to say about that.
I'm sure he does.
Yeah. He counters that dreams and visions are common across many religions and throughout history. He points to the ancient healing cult of Asclepius, which was based on dream visitations. And he says these kinds of subjective experiences don't really serve as historical proof.
Right. They might be really meaningful to the person.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that it's historically verifiable.
That's right.
Okay. And Bass even gives a theological explanation for this.
He does. He suggests that God, or Jesus, reveals himself to people who have open hearts and are seeking him.
Okay. And Ehrman is like...
Well, he identifies this as a religious viewpoint.
Right. Not a historical one, exactly.
Okay. So now we're getting to the heart of Ehrman's skepticism.
Right. That's right.
How does he frame this?
So Ehrman lays out his central methodological argument. And this is drawn from his vast experience. He's a well-established scholar. And he says historians operate by establishing probabilities. Based on the available historical evidence.
Okay. So we're looking at what's most likely to have happened.
That's right.
Given what we know.
That's right.
Okay.
And he says miracles, by their very definition, are the least probable of events.
Okay.
Because they violate natural laws.
Okay.
And regularities that we observe.
Right.
In the universe. Okay.
So he's saying miracles cannot be proven.
Okay.
Using the tools of historical inquiry.
Okay.
It's not that they didn't happen. It's just that we can't prove them historically.
Okay.
Because the tools we use don't allow for that.
Okay. That makes sense. And he really focuses on the fact that the Gospels were written decades after the events that they describe.
That's right.
Right.
He stresses that the Gospels are our main source of information.
Okay.
But they were written decades after the events, and they were written by authors who were not eyewitnesses to the events.
So how does that change things for him?
Well, he's saying they're relying on oral tradition that's been passed down and potentially changed and morphed.
Right. Telephone game.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
And he also points out that the Gospels actually contradict each other on a number of points.
Like what?
So there are variations in the day and time of Jesus' death.
Okay.
Who carried the cross.
Okay.
Who mocked Jesus while he was dying. Whether the tearing of the temple curtain happened before or after his death.
Okay.
Who went to the tomb, what they found there.
Yeah.
Was it one man or two men or an angel? What instructions they were given.
Yeah.
And whether the disciples were told to stay in Jerusalem.
Right.
Or go to Galilee.
Yeah.
So he points to all of these inconsistencies as evidence that the Gospels are not precise historical records of what actually happened.
Yeah. It's kind of a messy picture when you look at it that way.
It is. It is.
And he uses an analogy to illustrate how improbable he thinks the physical resurrection is.
Yes. He uses the analogy of stirring cream into your coffee.
Okay.
And then expecting it to separate back into cream and coffee.
Okay.
He's saying that's the kind of violation of natural law that a physical resurrection would require.
Gotcha.
And he's saying, even if you had a bunch of eyewitnesses claiming to have seen that happen, historians wouldn't really buy it.
Yeah. You'd need more than just...
You'd need a lot more.
Eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then he brings up the 500 again in this context.
Yeah. He compares it to Marian apparitions.
Yeah.
Where you have lots of people claiming to have seen Mary, but historians generally don't accept those as historically proven.
Okay.
And so he's suggesting a consistent skepticism towards extraordinary claims that defy natural laws.
Okay. So we've got these two very different approaches.
Right.
So let's just kind of recap those for a second. So Base
is constructing his argument based on the early claims that Jesus rose, the unexpected nature of those claims, the growth of Christianity, and the ongoing reports of visions and dreams.
Right. And Ehrman is coming at it from a totally different
angle.
Perspective.
He emphasizes the limitations of historical methodology when trying to prove miraculous events.
Okay.
He points out that there's a relative lack of contemporary eyewitness testimony.
Okay.
And that the Gospels have a lot of discrepancies.
Right.
And he tends to favor naturalistic explanations.
Oh, okay.
For what happened.
Okay. So no easy answers here.
No. Yeah. And we've tried to present both sides.
Yeah.
As fairly as we can.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we try to do with all these deep dives, right? It's just sort of lay out the different perspectives and let you, the listener, decide what you think.
That's right. That's right.
But this one in particular brings up a lot of really, really interesting sort of meta questions about like the nature of history.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what is history? How do we know what happened in the past?
Right. And what kind of evidence do we need to believe something happened?
And especially something that goes against everything we know about the natural world,
exactly.
You know? So I think this leads to a really interesting question for you, the listener, which is, what kind of evidence would you consider necessary?
Necessary or sufficient?
Yeah.
To establish the historical probability of a miracle.
Yeah. What would it take?
Yeah.
What would it take for you to believe that a miracle happened?
Right, right.
So that's something to think about.
I hope this has given you some things to chew on.
Yeah. And a framework for continuing to explore these questions.
Absolutely.
This is obviously a really big topic.
Huge.
There's tons of stuff out there.
So much to read.
Yeah. So we just wanted to give you kind of a starting point.
A starting point.
And some food for thought. So we really hope you enjoyed this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time.